Last week, I told you to give one more chance to A.J. Brown unless you had a truly elite option, but not to go crazy and start a guy like Troy Franklin over him. We talked about Terry McLaurin being far too risky with Marcus Mariota at quarterback. Now we turn to week 4, and I've got more high-risk start-sits for you. We will talk about their week 3 performances and expectations for week 4 and whether or not you should trust them. And of course, if you have any start-sit questions for any of the guys not on this list, drop them in the chat. There were high hopes for Dak Prescott in this game after moving him up significantly in rankings following an overall QB5 finish in week 2 against the Giants, where he threw for over 350 yards in what should have been a very advantageous matchup against a struggling Chicago defense in week 3. Prescott finished as QB17 with just 251 passing yards and 1 touchdown and 2 interceptions. Prescott certainly wasn't helped by losing his wide receiver 1 early in the game, and he will be without CeeDee Lamb again this week. George Pickens is more than adequate as a wide receiver 1, however, matchup is an issue here. While the Packers are fresh off an embarrassing loss to the Cleveland Browns, it was their offense that struggled, not the defense. The defense held Joe Flacco to under 150 yards, no touchdowns, and no Cleveland receiver exceeded 26 receiving yards. The Cowboys could take a similar approach to the Browns this week and lean heavily into the run, trying to attack the Packers that way rather than attacking the defense that has been successful in limiting pass yardage to both Jaden Daniels and Jared Goff. Prescott goes from being a top 5 option to a risky streaming option. Now, with all the quarterback injuries, you might be forced to stream him. Not the worst thing in the world, but if you have options, bench Dak, look elsewhere. After thriving as the Bengals' RB1 in 2024 and being one of my personal favorite running backs with a level of volume that made him widely considered one of the safest picks at running back this season, Chase Brown has failed to exceed 50 rushing yards in a single game this season and is fresh off arguably the worst performance of his entire career with just 10 carries for 3 yards. He is struggling on the ground, he is averaging less than 2 yards per carry, and he has seen a reduced role in the pass game as well. Still, Brown is the clear lead back, and the offensive struggles overall are just limiting his upside, especially this week. This week, he faces a Denver defense that has actually been very generous to running backs this season. In week 2, they gave up 165 yards to Jonathan Taylor. Last week, they gave Amari Hampton his best performance of his very young career, finishing as the overall RB5. It's possible that Brown could have a bounce-back game here, especially since one of the areas, again, where running backs have had success against the Broncos hasn't just been on the ground, it's been through the air, a skill set we need to be pushed forward with Chase Brown. Still, it is very tough to trust a running back whose best performance was barely scraping by as a low-end RB2, and that was with Joe Burrow. It is hard to imagine an increase in rushing success this week. Brown has to thrive through the air in order to justify the start. He's pushed back to a low-end RB2 at best, but more suitable as a risky flex play this week. Brian Thomas Jr. had just 2 receptions on 6 targets last week. That volume that we were depending on, it disappeared. Through 3 weeks this season, he has 7 receptions on 25 targets. That math doesn't seem correct, but that is factually what it is. For just 115 yards. And after scoring 10 touchdowns last season, he has none thus far. He barely has 100 receiving yards after posting over 1,200 last year. We joke all the time about Brian Thomas Jr.'s miraculous run with Mac Jones at quarterback and how much we miss him. And while that's true, it's not as if Trevor Lawrence and Brian Thomas Jr. had no success together. BTJ had 5 touchdowns through 9 games with Trevor. It was inconsistent, but there were big games. There is no reason that it should be this bad, and it's not as if Travis Hunter, who we don't even want to talk about, is cutting into his workload. The problem is that we have seen no real improvement from Trevor Lawrence, but Brian Thomas Jr. just flat out looks bad, Trevor Lawrence aside. It cannot all be blamed on Trevor. The drops have been seriously bad. BTJ has the lowest PFF receiving grade of any of the Jags pass catchers and the highest drop rate on the team. Combined, Brian Thomas Jr. struggles with Trevor Lawrence's inaccuracy and the Jaguars' run game actually thriving with both Travis Etienne and Bashal Tutin. The Jags might just opt to lean more on the running backs. Now, whether or not we get Brock Purdy this week might be the determining factor in whether or not we can trust Brian Thomas this game. But we can't bail out yet. If Purdy does return and the San Francisco 49ers offense can push game tempo a little bit and force more volume from the Jags, perhaps we can trust BTJ. Last week we talked about Mark Andrews and I said, and I quote, "Until he proves the touchdowns are going to come consistently, we cannot start him." Well, obviously, Mark Andrews is a fan of my YouTube channel, and he saw me make this statement, and he took it as a personal challenge and said, girl, I will show you touchdowns. And he hit us with 2 touchdowns. Okay, Mr. Andrews, that's amazing. But the question is whether or not we truly trust it, and are we allowing Andrews back into our circle of trust? Well, this is what happened last year, right? It just happened a couple of weeks earlier. Last year, after the abysmal start to the season in multiple 0 fantasy point games, Mark Andrews turned it on and became a touchdown magnet. Now, this 91-yard game that he had last week, that is the highest yardage that he has had since 2022. So take that as you will. But when he's on his A game, he is factually Lamar Jackson's favorite target in the red zone. I'm not pushing him back into the top 5 or anything crazy, but he is back into the top 12. He is a start, albeit still a risky start. For the record, I did start him last week in one tight end premium league that I have. I'm counting my blessings there. Under normal circumstances, Jordan Addison is not a risky start, but we are not under normal circumstances. He is fresh off a suspension, flying over to the UK for a massive time zone shift, and he's got a quarterback that he hasn't actually spent significant time with in Carson Wentz. Wentz had a fine start last week. It was good. They won the game, dominated, but it was very low volume from the start, but Cincinnati didn't exactly put up a fight. The Vikings leaned heavily on Jordan Mason, and they threw for just over 200 yards total. Wentz did not even have to play the whole game. That is how ugly this was. Minnesota's defense is absolutely disgusting, and Brian Flores is in his bag right now. But I do expect Aaron Rodgers and Pittsburgh to definitely put up more of a fight and make this more of a competitive game. So we should see Carson Wentz push a little bit more volume, and Pittsburgh's defense does continue to struggle here, and I expect Minnesota to be able to take advantage of it. Pittsburgh has allowed 7 total touchdowns to quarterbacks and allowed an average of 260 passing yards per game, which might not seem extravagant, but what you consider here is that this has been with Justin Fields, Sam Darnold, Drake May facing them at quarterback. Pittsburgh, we've got problems. It is risky. But Addison is in play as a flex option this week due to matchup. We just talked about it. Minnesota's defense is just plain nasty. Did I expect Jake Browning to have this bad of an outing? No, but I'm not shocked. This is a tough ask for a quarterback that lacks true experience and is factually going to struggle against this type of defense. Browning can still push volume in better matchups, and better days are ahead, but that's the problem there. The better days that are ahead, those are happening in 3 weeks. This week they face Denver, an angry Denver defense that has looked just a little bit off. Even Pat Surtain vocalized his frustration with himself previously. And last week against the Chargers, all 3 Chargers receivers were on, even Quentin Johnston, who was the one primarily facing Pat Surtain. But when you have Justin Herbert at quarterback, you can overcome difficult defenses. Do we trust Jake Browning to be able to confidently target his receivers in a tough secondary matchup? That's the issue here. Still, the ceiling for Jamar Chase is there. It is easy to forget that we did see Browning play the majority of the game in week 2, albeit in a better matchup there, and Jamar did have a whopping 14 receptions, over 150 yards, and a touchdown. Even in a difficult matchup, though, we cannot pull off of Chase. He is still a must start unless you're in a 16 league. Jacory Croskey-Merritt got the goal line touchdown here after Terry McLaurin was marked down at the 1 on a deep catch, but make no mistake, this is a committee. I want nothing to do with this Washington backfield. It is designed to be a committee. It was a committee last year, not because Brian Robinson wasn't good enough to be a lead back. It was a committee because that's just what Washington wants to do. And it is a low upside committee because Jaden Daniels and Marcus Mariota, for that matter, are such an integral part of the run game. The highest snap counts in the backfield was JCM. He had 23 snaps. That's not super good, not super reliable, but he had 23 snaps. Chris Rodriguez had 22 snaps. He actually had the most carries with 11 carries. He didn't get the touchdown. Jeremy McNichols only had 15 snaps, but he was the one that got the long breakaway touchdown. Still, despite the carries being tilted towards Rodriguez, ultimately I do think that JCM is the one that likely has the most fantasy relevance on a weekly basis if you're going to trust any of them. But you don't really want to trust any of them because crossing your fingers that a back gets a touchdown because volume doesn't really exist in a committee, that isn't the fantasy life that we want to live. And the Commanders don't really have any incentive to change their strategy because it is in fact working. He could still have a solid game and get the touchdown because the matchup isn't ideal, but it's not absolutely dreadful. Still, you have got to have better pivot options here that are more trustworthy. Pause here until we can get any kind of separation and snaps from this backfield. DK Metcalf's production this year has just been rather uninspiring, just a whole bunch of mediocrity from someone who was supposed to get hyper-targeted here. Thus far, we have had 17 targets on the year for Metcalf compared to 15 by Calvin Austin. That's not good. When you look at wide receiver ones across the league, the only player with less targets is Stefon Diggs. That is scary, especially because at least Stefon Diggs has the excuse of coming off of an injury and legitimately only being on the field for like 50% of the snaps. That stat does exclude the Packers since they technically don't have a wide receiver one, but it is a very concerning stat. This is just a function of the Pittsburgh offense. Rodgers threw for volume last year. We know that he can, but the Steelers' offense just straight up doesn't want to push high pass volume, and they won't change it no matter who is there. This means that we can expect more mediocre numbers for Metcalf, which actually does kind of make him relatively safe in theory, except when you get difficult matchups, because we can't depend on volume, we have to depend on a touchdown. And that is the issue with this week, a difficult matchup. I talked about the Minnesota defense. I talked about it way too much in this video. Now, this is not a complete no-go, because unlike Jake Browning, Aaron Rodgers, that's a completely different quarterback, right? He is more than capable of dealing with a difficult defense. But will the Steelers allow him to push volume? That is the question. DK Metcalf is still a flex option. Don't get me wrong on that one. But getting a touchdown here is a must. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like the video and subscribe to my channel. You can also find me across all social media platforms at It's Sarah Time, so make sure that you are tuned in, subscribed, and following because I will be bringing you more fantasy football advice all season long. Every week, I've got you covered with top waiver wire ads, live shows, live Q&A where you can ask any questions, and so much more.